What the European Union feared most has finally happened. Donald Trump has turned off the valve on liquefied natural gas supplies to Europe. Once again, the EU is forced to ask Vladimir Putin and Gazprom for gas. Europe has admitted to a catastrophic mistake, betting on American gas instead of Russian supplies. Now humiliated, it is returning to its old contracts with Gazprom, finally realizing that its entire economic model depended on favorable energy prices from Moscow. Germany, through Chancellor Friedrich Merz, openly stated that breaking energy ties with Russia was a strategic miscalculation. Alexei Miller confirmed that European representatives have already approached Gazprom with requests to resume gas supplies. Today, we will analyze this situation in detail. European leaders are now admitting one by one that abandoning Russian gas was a fatal mistake that destroyed the continent's chemical, metallurgical, and energy-intensive industries. We will find out why major German, French, and Italian corporations are shutting down factories en masse and relocating production to the United States and China, where energy is 3 to 4 times cheaper. We will also see how Moscow now has a unique opportunity to restore its influence by dictating terms to desperate Europeans who have no choice but to apologize and return to Russian supplies. Watch until the end to understand why Trump's threat to cut off American LNG became the final straw that forced Europe to admit the obvious. Without cheap Russian gas, Europe's economic model is not viable, and the continent is doomed to deindustrialization. Write in the comments whether you believe Europe deserves what it is facing for betraying Russia. Let us begin with how European leaders have come to this humiliating admission that the last 3 years of energy policy were a monstrous mistake that cost the continent trillions of euros and destroyed an industrial base built over decades. Chancellor Friedrich Merz became the first major European politician to publicly say what everyone knew but was afraid to admit. In a recent speech to industrial leaders of the Ruhr region, the traditional heart of Germany's heavy industry, Merz stated bluntly that the gas break with Russia was a strategic error that inflicted damage on the German economy comparable to the consequences of a world war. The German politician did not shy away from calling things by their proper names, admitting that the decision to abandon cheap, reliable Russian pipeline gas in favor of expensive and unstable American LNG was made under pressure from Washington and against Germany's national interests. We destroyed the energy foundation of our industrial power for political goals that turned out to be illusory, Merz declared, shocking the German establishment with his frankness. Germany's chemical giants, metallurgical conglomerates, and automobile manufacturers are all losing competitiveness because they pay 3 to 4 times more for gas than their American and Chinese competitors, who receive energy at reasonable prices. This admission struck like thunder from a clear sky, because for 3 years, German politicians had convinced the population of the need to make sacrifices to free themselves from Russian energy dependence. They promised that diversifying supplies and switching to American LNG would make Germany stronger and more independent. But reality turned out to be exactly the opposite, and now Merz is forced to admit the obvious. The German economic model built on cheap Russian energy simply cannot function at today's gas prices, which have increased several times compared to the era of Nord Stream and long-term contracts with Gazprom. Chemical giant BASF, the world's largest chemical producer and the pride of German industry, has announced the closure of several plants in Germany and the relocation of production to the United States and China, where energy costs allow profitability to be maintained. Write in the comments, do you think Germany can preserve its industry without Russian gas? Metallurgical enterprises that rely on natural gas as both an energy source and raw material for steel production are cutting capacity and laying off thousands of workers, unable to compete with Asian producers who have access to cheap energy. Automakers have suffered a double blow: rising production costs due to expensive energy, plus higher prices for components from European suppliers who are also suffering from the energy crisis. Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMW all are announcing production cuts in Germany and expanding capacity in countries with more favorable conditions. Germany is rapidly losing its status as Europe's industrial superpower and turning into a deindustrializing economy unable to compete in global markets. Merz understands that if this trend is not reversed, German industry will collapse completely within the next few years, leaving the country without an economic base and turning it into a peripheral service appendage of more successful industrial powers. That is why the Chancellor is ready to take the politically painful step of returning to Russian gas, despite predictable criticism from the Russophobic wing of the German elite and pressure from Washington demanding that the anti-Russian course be maintained at any cost. But Merz is a pragmatist, not an ideologue. He chooses the survival of the German economy over blindly following someone else's political agenda that leads the country to disaster. Admissions are coming not only from Germany, but from other European capitals as well. French industrialists openly state that abandoning Russian gas was an act of economic suicide, carried out under pressure from politicians who do not understand modern production realities. Italy's energy-intensive industries, especially in the north of the country where mechanical engineering and textile enterprises are concentrated, are massively cutting production and laying off staff, unable to withstand astronomical electricity and gas bills. Spanish metallurgical plants are idle because steel production at current energy prices has become unprofitable. The entire European industrial model, created after World War II and flourishing in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, was built on one fundamental principle: access to cheap, reliable energy, mainly from Russia, which was willing to supply gas under long-term contracts at fixed prices significantly lower than global spot prices. Nord Stream, Yamal Europe, Brotherhood. These pipelines carried more than just gas. They ensured energy security and economic competitiveness for the entire European continent, allowing local manufacturers to compete with American and Asian rivals on equal terms. Russia was the ideal energy partner for Europe. Geographic proximity minimized transport costs. Enormous reserves guaranteed uninterrupted supplies for decades. Developed pipeline infrastructure ensured reliability regardless of weather conditions, unlike LNG tankers that cannot operate in stormy seas. Most importantly, Russian gas was cheap because Moscow was interested in long-term, stable relations with European buyers and did not seek to maximize short-term profits, preferring strategic partnership over speculative price manipulation. Do you remember how Europeans celebrated the explosion of Nord Stream? Contracts with Gazprom provided Germany with gas at about $150 to $200 per thousand cubic meters, depending on global conditions, but within a predictable range that allowed industry to plan costs years ahead. After breaking ties with Russia and switching to American LNG, prices soared to $500, $800, and at peak moments to $1,500 per thousand cubic meters, turning production in many sectors unprofitable. Even after market stabilization, European prices remain 3 to 4 times higher than under Russian supplies, making European industry fundamentally uncompetitive. American LNG is not an alternative to Russian pipeline gas. It is a completely different product with a different pricing model and logistics. LNG requires expensive liquefaction infrastructure on the exporter's side, specialized tankers for transportation, and regasification terminals on the importer's side. Each stage adds costs that are ultimately paid by the end consumer. Moreover, American suppliers, unlike Gazprom, are not bound by long-term obligations and can redirect tankers at any moment to where prices are higher, leaving European buyers without gas at the most critical moment, as almost happened last winter. That is why Gazprom has already received official appeals from European countries asking to consider resuming supplies through old routes and signing new long-term contracts. Gazprom head Alexei Miller does not hide his satisfaction at the situation when those who 3 years ago mocked the explosion of Nord Stream and swore never to buy Russian gas again are now humbly asking to resume supplies, effectively admitting that without Russia the European economy is not viable. Miller confirmed that representatives from Germany requested emergency deliveries, which could be organized through the partially preserved Yamal-Europe pipeline via Belarus and Poland, as well as through LNG tankers from Russian Arctic fields. Russia, of course, will agree to help European partners, but on its own terms, which will differ significantly from those before the break in relations. Moscow is no longer interested in subsidizing European industry with artificially low gas prices and will demand market value plus a risk premium reflecting political instability and the possibility of new sanctions. In addition, Russia will insist on long-term contracts of 10 to denunciation, to 15 years, with strict penalties for early termination to protect itself from a repeat of the situation where Europeans again abandon Russian gas for political reasons, leaving Gazprom with underutilized capacity. Most painful for European elites is that the return to Russian gas will be accompanied by political conditions, including a review of sanctions, restoration of normal diplomatic dialogue, and an end to military aid to the Kyiv regime. Moscow will not save the European economy while Europe continues a hostile policy and supports Washington's anti-Russian course. The choice is simple. Either Europeans admit their mistake and return to pragmatic cooperation with Russia based on mutual respect, or they continue to follow American policy and watch the final deindustrialization of the continent. Write in the comments. Should Russia help Europe after everything they have done? The admission of error by European leaders is not an act of goodwill, but a forced capitulation to economic reality that can no longer be ignored. German, French, and Italian industrialists are literally besieging their governments, demanding an immediate solution to the energy problem, threatening mass layoffs and relocation of production outside Europe. Germany's chemical industry, the foundation of its industrial base, is on the brink of collapse. Fertilizer, plastics, and pharmaceutical production at current gas prices has become unprofitable. BASF has already announced the closure of its giant chemical complex in Ludwigshafen and the relocation of capacity to China, where authorities guarantee access to cheap energy. Metallurgy, another pillar of European industry, is experiencing a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. Steel and aluminum production are extremely energy-intensive process, requiring massive volumes of gas and electricity. At current European prices, European metallurgists simply cannot compete with Chinese, Indian, or even American producers who have access to cheap energy resources. Plants are closing one after another, leaving hundreds of thousands unemployed and destroying entire industrial regions, turning them into depressed zones with no prospects for recovery. The automotive industry, Germany's pride, and a symbol of European industrial superiority, is facing an existential crisis. Car production requires not only energy for factories, but also huge volumes of components from European suppliers, who also suffer from high energy costs. As a result, the cost of European cars is rising, making them uncompetitive compared to Chinese electric vehicles produced using cheap coal-based electricity. Volkswagen, Mercedes, and BMW are losing market share and forced to cut production in Europe while expanding in China and the United States, laying off workers at home. Food industry, energy, transport, all sectors of the European economy suffer from high gas prices, which are used not only as fuel, but also as raw material for fertilizer production needed in agriculture. Without cheap fertilizers, crop yields fall and food prices rise, hitting the pockets of ordinary Europeans already exhausted by inflation. and falling living standards. The entire economic model of European prosperity built on cheap Russian energy is collapsing before our eyes, showing that breaking ties with Moscow was not liberation but suicide. European leaders understand there is no time left to think. They must act immediately while there is still something to save. Merz has already stated that one of the first decisions of the government this year will be to begin negotiations with Russia on resuming long-term gas supplies to stabilize the energy situation and stop Germany's deindustrialization. French President Macron, although not publicly admitting mistakes, privately tells industrialists about the need for a pragmatic approach to Russia and the possibility of partially restoring energy cooperation despite political differences. Italy, Hungary, Austria, and Slovakia, countries that have always been more pragmatic in relations with Russia, openly advocate for immediate resumption of gas supplies and lifting sanctions that hinder normal economic cooperation. Even in Poland, traditionally Russophobic, where anti-Russian hysteria peaked, industrialists and economists increasingly demand that the government stop ideological games and start thinking about national economic interests suffering from the break with the main supplier of cheap energy. Write in the comments, would you forgive Europe for 3 years of Russophobia and betrayal? Moscow watches this process with understandable satisfaction, seeing the collapse of the anti-Russian front as European countries one by one admit that the course of energy independence from Russia was a catastrophic mistake. Russia proved its case not with words, but with deeds. While the European economy stagnates and loses industrial potential, Russia's economy continues to grow despite unprecedented sanctions, finding new gas markets in Asia and creating alternative transport routes independent of Europe. China, India, Turkey, and other fast-growing economies gladly buy Russian gas at reasonable prices, developing their industries, while Europe voluntarily gave up this advantage for political goals. Now, as Europeans return to ask for renewed supplies, they face a new reality where Russia no longer needs the European market as desperately as before and can dictate its terms. Gazprom has already redirected a significant part of export capacity eastward, building Power of Siberia and planning new routes connecting Russian fields with the Chinese market, ensuring stable demand for decades ahead. Europe has gone from priority direction to secondary. Moscow will work with it only on favorable terms, without political concessions or discounted prices. The humiliation of European elites forced to admit their mistake and return to Russian gas is just retribution for 3 years of Russophobic hysteria, economic sanctions, and support for Washington's anti-Russian policy. Europeans believed they could manage without Russia by relying on American LNG, renewables, and reduced consumption. But reality proved harsher than illusion. An industrial economy cannot exist without reliable, cheap energy sources. For Europe, that source always was and remains Russia, with its colossal gas reserves and willingness for long-term cooperation on mutually beneficial terms. The coming months will show how far European leaders are willing to go in admitting their mistake and what conditions they are ready to accept to save their economies. Negotiations with Gazprom have already begun, and their outcome will determine Europe's future.